I followed her all the way to the end of the parking lot before my legs stopped working. That's the only way I can describe it. My legs just stopped. Like the signal between my brain and my body got cut somewhere around the third row of cars, and I stood there between a pickup truck and a minivan, watching her load groceries into the back of a silver Nissan that I had never seen before in my life. It was a Tuesday. I know it was a Tuesday because I only go to the superstore on Tuesdays ever since my wife passed. That was her system, and after she was gone, I just kept doing it. Tuesdays. Aisle by aisle, list in my pocket, same checkout lane if it was open. It gave the week a shape when everything else had gone shapeless. My wife's name was Lorraine. She died 14 months before that Tuesday. Or at least, that's what I believed with every part of myself. I need to go back a little, because none of this makes sense without the beginning. Lorraine and I met in the summer of 1979 at a campground outside of Sudbury. I was 24 years old and working for an engineering firm, and she was there with a group of friends from nursing school. She had red hair, not orange, not auburn, but genuinely red, the kind that catches light like it's doing it on purpose. She laughed at something her friend said, and I thought I would very much like to be the reason someone like that laughs. We were married 11 months later. We settled in Barrie, Ontario. I spent 31 years doing infrastructure work for the same firm, and Lorraine worked at the hospital until our son was born, then part-time after that, then eventually came back full-time when he started high school. We were not a dramatic couple. We did not have blow-up fights or grand gestures. We had a vegetable garden and a mortgage that we paid off in 2003, and a son named Patrick who grew up to be a decent, serious man who married a woman named Fiona and gave us 2 grandchildren. That was our life. Quiet. Predictable. Ours. Lorraine was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in the spring of 2022. Stage 3. The doctors were not pessimistic exactly, but they were careful with their words in the way that tells you more than the words themselves. She did 2 rounds of chemo. She lost the red hair. She got tired in a way she'd never been tired before, a bone-deep tired that she described once as feeling like she was being slowly unplugged. We held hands a lot that year. We watched old movies. I learned to make her mother's butter chicken recipe because it was one of the few things that didn't turn her stomach. She passed on a Thursday morning in November, in the bedroom of the house we'd shared for over 40 years. Patrick was there. I was there. It was quiet, the way she'd wanted. The funeral was at the United Church on Dunlop Street, where she'd been a member since before we met. Her sister Constance flew in from Victoria. There were flowers. People said kind things. I stood beside Patrick at the reception and shook hands and said thank you so many times that the words lost their shape. When everyone left, I sat in the kitchen and didn't turn the lights on until 9 o'clock at night. I'm telling you this so you understand the weight of what I'm about to say. 14 months later, I was pushing a cart past the yogurt section in the superstore on Bayfield Street when I saw a woman standing at the far end of the dairy aisle, reading the back of a container of cream cheese. She was wearing a grey parka and dark jeans. Her hair was shorter than Lorraine's had been, and a different color, brown, almost chestnut. But the way she was standing, the slight tilt to the left, one hip out just a fraction. I had watched that posture for 43 years across 1,000 kitchens and living rooms and grocery stores. I told myself I was being irrational. That grief does things to the mind. I had read about this, actually. Grief hallucinations, they call them, or post-bereavement apparitions. Perfectly normal, apparently, for people to see a deceased spouse in a crowd. The brain looks for what it loves. I turned my cart around and went to the bread aisle. And then I heard her laugh. It came from somewhere behind me, and it was short, just a quick sound in response to something the woman beside her said, but it moved through me like cold water. Lorraine had a very specific laugh. Not unusual, not remarkable to anyone else, but to me it was as identifiable as a fingerprint. A small, genuine sound that crinkled her eyes before her mouth even opened. I turned around. She was talking to another woman I didn't recognize. She was smiling. Her cart had kale in it, and a box of those crackers she used to buy from the British import section. The ones she could never get me to eat. I stood there for what felt like a long time, but was probably 8 seconds. Then I did something I cannot fully explain. I left my cart where it was. I went to the front of the stall, grabbed a basket, and I followed her. Not close. I stayed an aisle behind, moving when she moved, stopping when she stopped. I watched her buy 2 kinds of cheese, and a box of Earl Grey tea, and a package of the thin sliced turkey she always said was the only deli meat worth buying. I watched her stop to look at a display of Valentine's Day cards that were already going up, even though it was barely January. She picked one up, read it, put it back. She did that with 3 cards before she settled on one. I could not see her hands clearly from where I was standing. I needed to see her hands. Lorraine had a scar on the back of her left hand. She'd gotten it in 1987 from a kitchen accident involving a broken casserole dish. It wasn't large, maybe 2 centimeters, slightly curved, just below the knuckle of her ring finger. In 43 years, I had held that hand enough times that I could have drawn that scar from memory in the dark. She moved toward the checkout. I moved closer. At the self-checkout, she set down her basket and started scanning items. I positioned myself at the machine beside her under the pretense of checking out my own basket, which contained a single box of pasta I'd grabbed without looking. She reached for her phone to pull up her PC Optimum app, and her sleeve slid back. The scar was there. I gripped the edge of the machine. She finished her transaction, collected her bags, and walked toward the exit without looking at me once. I don't think she saw me. I don't know what I would have done if she had. I left my pasta on the machine and I followed her out. She walked to the silver Nissan in the 3rd row and loaded her bags and got in. I was parked 6 spots away. My hands were shaking when I started the car. I followed her out of the parking lot. She took Dunlop to Duckworth and then up into a neighborhood I knew moderately well, a quiet residential area with mature trees and older 2-story homes. She turned onto a street called Fernwood Crescent and pulled into the driveway of a yellow brick house with a green front door. She gathered her bags, went inside. The green door closed behind her. I parked at the curb 2 houses down and sat there for 45 minutes. Then I drove home and sat at the kitchen table and tried to think clearly about what I had just seen. I am not an irrational man. I spent my career in engineering. I believe in evidence. I believe in process. I do not believe in ghosts. What I believed in, sitting at that table, was the scar on the back of that woman's left hand, and the laugh I had heard in the dairy aisle, and the crackers from the British import section, and the way her hip tilted when she stood still. I also believed in what I had seen at the funeral, the closed casket, which I had accepted without question, because I was told the accident had caused significant injuries. The paperwork that Patrick had handled, because I was not capable of handling paperwork in those first 2 weeks. The headstone in the cemetery on Grove Street that I had visited 6 times since November of 2022. I went upstairs and found the folder where I kept important documents, insurance papers, the mortgage discharge, our wills. Lorraine's death certificate was there. I read it, then I read it again. I called Patrick the next morning. I didn't tell him what I'd seen. I said I had some questions about some of the documents from after his mother passed, that I wanted to go over a few things together. He said of course he'd come by Saturday. In the 3 days between that phone call and Saturday, I drove past the yellow house on Fernwood Crescent 2 more times. Once the green door was open and I could see a light on inside. Once a man I didn't recognize was shoveling the front walk, mid-50s, heavy-set, baseball cap. He worked steadily without looking up. I also went to the Barry Public Library and used one of the computers there to do something I had never done before in my life. I looked up how to request a copy of an autopsy report in Ontario. Saturday came. Patrick arrived at noon. Fiona was with him. I had made coffee and put out some of the shortbread that Constance had sent at Christmas. We sat at the kitchen table and I watched my son's face and tried to remember that I had loved and trusted this person for 62 years. I showed him the questions I had written down about the death certificate, about who had identified the body, about the accident, which I had understood to be a single vehicle incident on Highway 26, and which I had never, in 14 months, asked a single detailed question about, because I had been drowning. Patrick was quiet for a long time after I asked the last question. He put his coffee mug down very carefully. He looked at the table. Then he looked at me. "Dad," he said, "I need to tell you something." Fiona left the room. I noticed that she left without being asked. What Patrick told me over the next hour was this. The woman who died in the accident on Highway 26 was not his mother. The woman who died was a woman his mother had met through a support group, a woman in her late 60s who had no close family, who was dying of a degenerative illness and had perhaps months to live. I won't use her name here because whatever happened, she deserved her dignity. She had agreed, according to Patrick, to something I still do not fully understand the mechanics of, that her passing would be used, that there would be a closed casket, that the documentation would be managed by Patrick, who had power of attorney, and who had, it turned out, been helping his mother plan this for the better part of a year. Lorraine had a second life. She had been building it quietly for over a decade, a relationship with the man I had seen shoveling snow, a man named, it doesn't matter, a house that she had purchased in her maiden name in 2014, a life that she had constructed in the margins of our life, in the spaces between her shifts and her book club and her sister's visits and her doctor's appointments. The cancer diagnosis, Patrick told me, was real. The treatment was real, but it had given her a timeline and a cover, and she had used both. The insurance payout from her death, just over $400,000 from the policy I had maintained for 30 years, had been transferred in a way that I am still not entirely clear on, through a series of steps that Patrick said he had been assured were legal and that I now know were not. I did not shout. I am telling you this because I was afraid I might, and I didn't. I sat at my own kitchen table, and I listened to my son explain how he had helped his mother disappear from my life, and I did not shout. I asked him one question when he was done. I asked him if he had understood, when he agreed to this, that the woman who would be buried was not his mother. He said yes. I asked him to leave. He started to say something, and I said, "Please leave my house." I want to be honest about the weeks that followed because I think the honest version is more useful than the clean version. I did not handle it well. I'm 68 years old and I had been widowed. I had genuinely, completely believed myself to be widowed, and the grief I had carried for 14 months was real, the way a phantom limb is real. Finding out that Lorraine was alive did not undo that grief. It transformed it into something stranger and heavier, something without a name that I know of. I stopped going to the grocery store on Tuesdays. I stopped going anywhere for a while. A friend of mine, a retired doctor I've known since our boys played hockey together, came and sat with me twice a week for about a month. He didn't try to fix anything. He just came and drank bad coffee and said nothing particularly wise, and that was exactly what I needed. I also called a lawyer, a very good lawyer as it turned out, recommended by my financial advisor. What followed was not simple and it was not fast, but I will tell you the shape of it. Lorraine was found. I don't mean I found her. The authorities found her once I had given them what I knew. The man on Fernwood Crescent. The financial trail that my lawyer's forensic accountant was able to follow backward through the transfers. The involvement of a notary in Midland who has since been disbarred. The insurance company recovered the funds. That process took 11 months and was, frankly, exhausting in a way that I hadn't expected. A different kind of exhausting than grief. More like being slowly ground down by paperwork and phone calls and waiting. But it was resolved. Lorraine was charged with fraud over $5,000, which in Canada carries serious weight, and with several related offenses connected to the death certificate and the identification of the deceased. The proceedings are a matter of public record, and I do not need to detail them further here. Patrick is a more complicated story. I am still working through what I feel about my son. I will say that he did eventually cooperate fully with the investigation, and that this cooperation was significant. I will say that he has 2 children who did not choose any of this, a 7-year-old named Isaac and a 5-year-old named June, who call me Grandpa, and who I am not willing to lose. So I am finding a way forward there, slowly, with the help of a counselor who specializes in family estrangement. It is not easy. Some weeks it is barely possible, but I am doing it. There is something I want to say to anyone who is listening to this and who recognizes any part of it, not necessarily the extreme circumstances, but the underneath of it. The way a person can be so certain they know the shape of their life, so certain they understand a person sleeping beside them, that they don't look too closely at the edges. I was not a neglectful husband. I was not absent or unkind. I've gone over it enough times that I can say that with reasonable confidence now, though it took a long time to get there. Whatever Lorraine was doing, whatever she needed that she couldn't ask me for or couldn't build inside our life, I don't think that was entirely about something I failed to provide. Some people construct secret exits long before they know they need them. Some people are at their core building toward a departure that even they don't fully understand. What I do know is that I spent 14 months grieving a woman who was alive and spending my money 3 kilometers away. And the strangest part, the part I think about most, alone in this house on Tuesday evenings, is that in some ways the grief was real and warranted and necessary, even so, because the woman I had been married to, the woman I believed I knew, she was gone. Whatever was living in that yellow house on Fernwood Crescent, whatever version of Lorraine had been building that other life for 10 years, while I grew vegetables and paid the mortgage and learned to make butter chicken, that was not the woman I had loved. That woman, I think, had been gone for a long time before I knew to look for her. I am 68 years old. I live in the same house I have lived in for 41 years. My vegetable garden came back this past summer. I planted the same things: tomatoes, beans, the little yellow peppers that never do as well as I hope, but that I plant anyway. There is a woman I have dinner with occasionally, a retired teacher from Aurelia who lost her husband 3 years ago. We do not talk about the future very much. We talk about books and our grandchildren and what is good on television. It is, I realize now, a remarkable thing, a truly remarkable thing, to sit across from someone and have no reason to doubt what you're seeing. I am learning to pay attention to that, to not take it for granted the way I took so many things for granted. I don't know what else to tell you, except this: it is possible to be deceived completely by someone you loved completely, and to survive it, and to find, somewhere on the other side of all that paperwork and grief and bad coffee, that you are still, more or less, yourself. That's not nothing. Some days, that's everything. I planted the beans a little later than usual this past spring. Nothing dramatic, I just kept finding other things to do in the morning, other reasons to stay inside. But eventually, I went out there, and I turned the soil over, and I put the seeds in the ground the way I have done for 30 years, and something about the ordinariness of it helped me more than I expected. I have thought a lot about what it means to do the right thing when no one is making you. The rain had every legal right to leave. People leave marriages. That is not a crime, and it is not unusual, and I would have been hurt, but I would have survived it the way people survive things. What I cannot reconcile, what I think about on the drives to Aurelia, on the evenings when the house gets quiet, is the choice to deceive. Not once, not in a moment of panic, but consistently, deliberately, over years. That kind of sustained dishonesty requires a person to make the same decision hundreds of times. To look at someone who trusts them and choose, again, not to be truthful, that is not a single mistake. That is a direction a person decides to travel in. And the consequences of that direction were not small. A woman was buried under Lorraine's name. Whatever the circumstances, whatever was agreed to, that woman's passing was used as a prop. An insurance company was defrauded. A son was made complicit in something he will carry for the rest of his life. I think about Patrick more than I probably should. He is not a bad man. He made choices I cannot defend, but he is not a bad man, and watching him navigate what he did, the cooperation, the shame, the slow and uncomfortable work of trying to repair something, I think he understands now what his mother perhaps never quite did, which is that the people around us are not scenery. The damage we do to them is real, and it compounds. I did not handle the months after the discovery with any particular grace. I want to be honest about that. I was angry and I was disoriented, and there were weeks where I made very poor decisions about how much whiskey was an appropriate amount of whiskey for a Tuesday evening. What got me through was not some great reservoir of inner strength I discovered. It was smaller than that. It was my friend coming on Thursdays. It was the lawyer who explained things patiently and didn't talk to me like I was fragile. It was Isaac asking me at Christmas if we were still going to build the birdhouse, because he hadn't forgotten that I'd promised. I hadn't forgotten I'd promised. We built it in February in the garage, with the small hands and the large ambitions that 7-year-olds bring to everything. That is what I mean when I say that surviving something like this is not about being strong in the way people mean when they say, be strong. It is about staying clear-headed enough to ask the right questions of your lawyer, of your son, of yourself. It is about being honest about what you know and what you don't, and not letting shame or grief or the desire for a simple explanation keep you from understanding what actually happened. And it is about getting up on the days when getting up is genuinely difficult. Not because you feel like it, but because there is a birdhouse to build and a garden that will come back in the spring whether you are ready for it or not. The woman I have dinner with in Aurelia asked me once, carefully, if I was bitter. I thought about it for a while before I answered. I said I didn't think bitterness was the right word. I said I thought I was something more like awake, paying attention in a way I wasn't before. That is not nothing. That might in fact be the only thing worth keeping from any of this.